Hello, History 102, and welcome to Chapter 28 of Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty. This week we're talking about the Obama and Trump administrations, a divided nation. The years following the attacks of September 11, 2001 produced great political surprises. Widespread dissatisfaction with established political leadership enabled relative newcomers to national politics to reach the White House in the presidential elections of 2008 and 2016. Barack Obama, a first term U.S. Senator from Illinois and the first African American to win a major party's presidential nomination, and Donald Trump, a New York real estate developer and television personality with no political experience at all. Both appealed successfully to a desire for new political leadership and a sense that the country was moving in the wrong direction. Both made effective use of the internet and new social media to spread their messages. Both inspired rapturous enthusiasm from supporters but deep resentments from opponents. In their political philosophies, personal demeanor, and sources of electoral support, however, Trump and Obama could not have been more different. What was certain was that Americans were as deeply divided in their social and political outlooks as at any point since the Civil War. Whatever one's opinion of Obama's policies, there's no question that in the view of the nation's racial history, the election and re-election of the first African American president marked an important turning point. Yet the election of Trump succeeded him with a campaign that forthrightly appealed to voters who were hostile to immigration and resentful that a black man occupied the White House, suggested that issues as old as the Republic, namely determining who is an American and who is entitled to full freedom and equality, remained as contested as ever. Here we see newly naturalized citizens reciting the Oath of Allegiance at a Brooklyn federal courthouse in 2016. The portraits on the wall depict former federal judges. This week, we're going to be talking about the Great Recession and Obama's presidency and efforts to turn that back, and then President Trump and his policies, concluding with freedom in the 20th century for our final lecture of this semester. Our first focus question: what events eroded support for President Bush's policies during his second term? With the jobless recovery and the Iraq War harming Bush's popularity, in 2004, the Democrats thought they could retake the White House. They nominated as their candidate John Kerry, a Massachusetts senator and decorated Vietnam combat veteran who had joined the anti-war movement. The party hoped that Kerry's military experience would deflect attacks that Democrats were too weak to be trusted to protect the United States from terrorism, while his anti-war credentials from the Vietnam era would appeal to those who opposed the Iraq War. But Kerry proved ineffective, lacking charisma, and unable to generate enthusiasm. Bush won only narrowly, with a margin of 2% of the popular vote, and by only 34 electoral votes. The results revealed electoral stability. Both sides spent tens of thousands of dollars and mobilized 20 million new voters, but in the end, only 3 states voted differently than in 2000. At his second inaugural address, Bush promised to use American power to end tyranny in the world, and again repetitively invoked freedom and America's mission to spread it throughout the world. Republicans were overjoyed by Bush's triumph, but continuing chaos in Iraq, coupled with corruption scandals among Republicans in Congress and the White House, eroded Bush's standing. Vice President Dick Cheney's chief of staff was convicted of perjury in connection with an investigation of the illegal leak to press the name of the CIA operative whose husband had criticized the manipulation of intelligence before the Iraq invasion. He was the first White House official to be indicted while holding office since 1875. Bush's popularity declined steadily, falling to 31% in 2006. The Bush administration suffered another blow in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans. Located below sea level, New Orleans is vulnerable to flooding, and despite scientists' warnings, the levee system had not been reinforced by the federal government. The levees broke when the storm hit on August 29th, and nearly the entire city, with a population of 500,000, was flooded. Nearby areas of Louisiana and the Mississippi Gulf Coast were also hard hit. The natural disaster was quickly compounded by mistakes made at all levels of government. The mayor had ordered evacuations too late and not provided for those who were unable to leave the city. The Federal Emergency Management Administration, FEMA, had done almost nothing to prepare for it. President Bush seemed unaware of the devastation and unable to do anything about it. For days, thousands of people, mostly poor African Americans, were abandoned in the floodwaters. Government officials seemed unaware that thousands were still in the city and without food, water, or shelter. Bodies floated in the streets, and people died in city hospitals and nursing homes. When aid started arriving, the storm had caused $80 billion in damage, killed 15,000 people, and displaced two-thirds of the city's population. The storm made Americans aware once more of the extent of poverty in the world's richest nation. Decades of state and local policies of pursuing economic growth through low-wage, non-union employment and low investment in education, health, and social welfare had produced a large poor population in the South. Nearly 30% of New Orleans' population lived in poverty. Here we see residents of New Orleans stranded on top of a rooftop days after floodwaters engulfed the city, frantically trying to attract the attention of rescue helicopters. The attacks of September 11th and the subsequent War on Terror threw into sharp relief the status of American borders and borderlands, especially in the Southwest. The existence of a borderland with strong community ties in both the United States and Mexico had always been a source of tension. Fears of terrorists crossing the borders merged with older worries of undocumented immigrants and the growth of Hispanic culture. Bush and Obama administrations greatly accelerated efforts to police the border. Latino communities experienced the Southwest borderlands as increasingly militarized, while some Americans claimed that the American government was not doing enough to enforce the border. Ironically, the result of tighter controls over back and forth migration. While many immigrants had traveled freely across the border in the past, now more immigrants simply stayed put. In early 2006, the debate over immigration exploded. The immigration reforms of 1965 had dramatically transformed immigration patterns and especially contributed to the rapid growth of the Hispanic population, and immigration grew in the first years of the 21st century. Many new immigrants bypassed the major cities and moved into small cities and towns in the Midwest, New England, and Upper South. Racial and ethnic diversity was now a fact of life in the American heartland. Undocumented newcomers, mostly from Mexico, also came to the United States. By 2005, it was estimated that 11 million illegal aliens were in the country, with 7 million of them in the workforce. Economists tend to disagree about their impact. While it seems clear that large numbers of uneducated and low-skilled workers push down wages at the bottom of the labor market, on the other hand, both illegal and legal immigrants spend money, pay taxes, and work at jobs for which most Americans seem unavailable, given the low wages. Some analysts estimate that 1/5 of all construction workers, domestic workers, and agricultural workers are in the United States illegally. By 2006, with many Americans convinced that the United States had lost control of their borders, the House of Representatives approved a bill making it a felony to be in the United States illegally and a crime to offer aid to illegal immigrants. The bill sparked a massive series of demonstrations in spring of 2006 by hundreds of thousands of legal and illegal immigrants and their allies, demanding the right for illegal immigrants to remain in the country as citizens. The immigration issue was at a stalemate, and it still remains so today. After September 11, 2001, religious liberty in the United States came under attack from domestic pressures. 5 years before 9/11, the political scientist Samuel P. Huntington had published a widely noted book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order, which had argued that a new conflict between Western and Islamic civilizations was coming to fill the void left by the end of the Cold War. Huntington's model became very popular because it was easy to digest and appeared to offer a simple explanation for the terrorist attacks. Thus, even though President Bush insisted that a war on terror was not against Islam, many Americans found it difficult or refused to separate the two. Most Muslim Americans were appalled by the terror attacks. Some critics claimed that Islam was fundamentally incompatible with American life, a position reminiscent of the prejudice in the 19th century against Catholics and Mormons. This is Out of the Shadows. In 2015, artist J.R. took photographs of immigrants and affixed them to the walls in New York City buildings and to other public places. This image is of Kamola Akilova from Uzbekistan. The purpose, according to the artist, is to take immigrants out of the shadows and make people aware of their presence in the cities. Members of the Texas Minutemen are patrolling the U.S.-Mexico border. Claiming that the federal government was failing to prevent undocumented immigrants from entering the United States, vigilantes tried to do so on their own. The U.S.-Canadian border, which stretches for over 3,000 miles, has been called the world's largest undefended border. With borders becoming more contested lately, however, it has seen increasing restrictions on crossing, but as yet no armed patrols, unlike the Mexican border. As in the previous 2 decades, conservatives were far better at implementing their economic and foreign policy than implementing their cultural views. Supreme Court rulings in 2003 showed how the social revolution wrought by the 1960s was not going to be undone. Ruling on challenges to the University of Michigan's admissions policies, the court upheld the right of colleges and universities to take race into account on admissions decisions, arguing that these institutions had a legitimate interest in creating diverse student bodies to enhance education. The Bush administration had encouraged the court to reject affirmative action. In a second decision in Lawrence v. Texas, the court struck down a Texas law that made homosexual acts a crime, paving the way for the 2015 Obergefell v. Hodges ruling, which overturned state laws banning marriages for same-sex couples. In 2003, two-thirds of Americans opposed legalizing gay marriage, but by the time of the 2015 ruling, 60% were in favor. The decision supported movement's campaigns to extend freedoms into personal life and repudiated conservative views that the constitutional interpretation must rest on the Founding Fathers' original intent, or a narrow reading of the document. Instead, the Constitution was a living document whose protections expand as society changes. The Iraq War, with Hurricane Katrina disaster and the scandals in Congress, provoked widespread public discontent in 2006, and that year Democrats won major gains in congressional elections. Voters repudiating the administration gave Democrats control of both houses of Congress for the first time since 1994. In 2007, Nancy Pelosi of California became the first female Speaker of the House in American history. In January of 2009, when Bush left office, only 22% of Americans approved of his performance in office, the lowest figure since these polls began in the mid-20th century. It was difficult to see many achievements in Bush's 8 years. His foreign policy had alienated much of the world and left the United States militarily weakened and diplomatically isolated. His tax cuts for the wealthy and the cost of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had transformed budget surpluses into enormous deficits, and his reforms in immigration and Social Security went nowhere, and the number of Americans living in poverty and those without health insurance rose during his first term. Demonstrators in New York City here opposed plans for an Islamic cultural center near the World Trade Center site. Our next focus question: what were the economic practices that contributed to the crisis of 2008? In late 2007, the economy entered a recession. In 2008, the U.S. financial system was on the verge of total collapse. The roots of the 2008 crisis lay in a combination of public and private policies that favored economic speculation, wild spending, and get-rich-quick schemes over more traditional paths to economic growth and advancement. For years, the Federal Reserve had kept interest rates very low to help the economy recover and to enable Americans to borrow money to buy homes. The result was a new bubble as housing prices rose rapidly. Consumer debt also rose dramatically as people who owned houses took out second mortgage and spent to the limits on their credit cards. In mid-2008, an average American family owed an enormous amount of debt. All of this borrowing fueled increases in spending, as Americans spent more, saved less, and saw more jobs shipped overseas, even while household incomes stagnated. China helped finance America's spending spree by buying billions of dollars of federal bonds, effectively loaning money to the United States so that it could purchase Chinese-made goods. Banks and other lenders issued more and more subprime mortgages, risky loans to people who lacked the income to make monthly payments. The initially low interest rates on these loans rose dramatically within a year or two, and banks assumed home prices would continue to rise. Wall Street bankers created complex new ways of repackaging and selling these mortgages to investors. Insurance companies, including the world's largest American International Group, insured these new financial products against future default. Leaving the market to regulate itself, the Federal Reserve Bank and other regulatory agencies did nothing to slow the speculative frenzy, as banks and investment firms reported billions of dollars in profits and rewarded executives with huge bonuses. By 2006 and 2007, excess housing construction caused home prices to begin to fall. As increasing numbers of homeowners defaulted, meaning they were unable to pay, on their monthly mortgage payments. In 2008, the situation reached a crisis stage as banks stopped making loans, business dried up, and the stock market collapsed. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, once above 14,000, dropped to around 8,000, the worst percentage decline since 1931. Lehman Brothers, the venerable investment house, recorded a $2.3 billion loss and disappeared, the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. Lending banks seemed about to fail. With their home value and stock prices falling, Americans reduced spending, which led to business failures and a rapid rise in unemployment. The gross domestic product of the United States contracted dramatically by 6%. Most damaged was Americans' confidence as they lost their homes or jobs and watched their retirement savings and pensions, if invested in the stock market, disappear. In April of 2009, the recession that started in 2007 became the longest since the Great Depression. In the Great Recession, the mortgage crisis affected minorities most since people had been steered by banks into subprime mortgages even when they had the assets and income to qualify for traditional loans. As a result, foreclosures were the highest in minority areas. In 2012, Wells Fargo Bank, the nation's largest home lender, agreed to pay $175 million to settle claims that its brokers charged higher fees to blacks and Hispanics who borrowed money than it did to whites with comparable incomes, and that put them into the risky subprime mortgages. Like other scandals in the past, Bush-era scandals damaged confidence in the ethics of corporate leaders and seemed to repeat the get-rich-quick ethos, connection between business and government, passion for deregulation, and corruption that had contributed to the earlier economic crises. Public anger at bankers and stockbrokers skyrocketed as Wall Street firms fired thousands of employees but paid out billions of dollars in bonuses to top executives. Between 2009 and 2015, major banks were forced to pay fines totaling over $100 billion for criminal actions. Yet banks' profits are so large that the institutions accepted these fines as a minor cost of doing business. No individual executive was charged with a crime, and the Securities and Exchange Commission granted waivers from penalties. It was also revealed that Bernard Madoff, a Wall Street investor, had run a massive Ponzi scheme in which he sent fictitious statements to his clients but never actually made stock purchases for them. His investors lost $50 billion. Madoff pled guilty to fraud in 2009 and was sentenced to 150 years in prison. Madoff's case mirrored the American economy. For years, its growth had been based on borrowing from others and spending money people didn't have. This graph shows median home prices in both Florida and the rest of the United States, and you can see after 2007 how the prices plummeted. These plummeting prices led to many unfinished housing projects just being abandoned. And this graph offers a visual illustration of the steep decline in the American economy in 2008 and 2009, with a slow recovery in 2012. The crisis showed a dark side of market fundamentalism, the ethos of deregulation that dominated world affairs in recent decades. Alan Greenspan, the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank from 1987 to 2006, had steered the U.S. economy through multiple crises and presided over much deregulation, artificially low interest rates, and excessive borrowing and spending. He and his successors had promoted the housing bubble and allowed speculation to flourish without government intervention, effectively allowing securities firms to regulate themselves. In 2008, Greenspan conceded to Congress that there had been a flaw in his belief that the free markets automatically produce the best results for all, and that regulation would damage the banks, Wall Street, and the mortgage market. And he said he was shocked by the crisis. His testimony seemed to mark the end of an era in which every president from Reagan onward had told the world to adopt the U.S. model of unregulated economic competition. Now the U.S. model lay in ruins, and a new role for government in regulating the economy became inevitable. In the fall of 2008, the Bush administration seemed unable to address the crisis. Sticking to free market principles, it allowed the Lehman Brothers to fail, but this sent stock prices of other banks and investment houses into a free fall. The administration quickly reversed course. It persuaded Congress to appropriate $700 billion and bail out failing firms. Through the federal bailout, taxpayers effectively took temporary ownership of these companies, absorbing their massive losses. Despite the bailout, the bank system was still increasingly fragile. The crisis also exposed the paucity of the U.S. safety net when compared to that of other industrial nations. In Western Europe, laid off workers received many months of unemployment insurance, but in the United States, only a third of jobless even qualified for unemployment insurance, which ran out for most in a few months. The abolition of welfare during the Clinton administration left only a patchwork of national programs, like food stamps for the newly poor and state funds for poor relief, and these were quickly exhausted as tax revenues disappeared. In 2012, only 1 in 5 poor children received any cash aid, the lowest percentage in half a century. This cartoon suggests that the near collapse of the financial system in 2008 indicates the need for a little more regulation. A little-known 47-year-old from Illinois when the campaign of 2008 began, Barack Obama owed his success to both his own exceptional skills as a speaker and campaigner and to the evolution of American politics and society during his lifetime. Without the civil rights movement, his election would have been inconceivable. And he was the product of an interracial marriage, which ended in divorce when he was only 2 years old, between a Kenyan immigrant and a white American woman. When Obama was born in 1961, their marriage would have been illegal in many states. He attended Harvard Law School and worked in Chicago as a community organizer before going into politics. Obama was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2004 and gained national attention with an eloquent speech at the Democratic National Convention that year. His early opposition to the Iraq War won support of the Democratic Party's large anti-war element. His race galvanized support of black voters, and his promise of change appealed to the young. Obama faced Republican nominee Senator John McCain from Arizona in the general election. At the age of 72, McCain was the oldest man ever to run for president, and he surprised everyone by choosing as his running mate Sarah Palin, a little-known governor of Alaska. Palin quickly attacked Democrats for being unpatriotic, lacking traditional values, and not representing real America. While this was very popular with the Republican base, her performance made it clear that she lacked knowledge of many domestic and foreign issues the new administration would confront, and many Americans came to question McCain's judgment in appointing her his running mate. But McCain faced President Bush's sinking popularity and the financial crisis, which reached new depths in September and October right before the general election. Obama's promise of change carried the day, and he won 53% of the popular vote and a large majority of the Electoral College. The election redrew the nation's political map. Obama carried both Democratic strongholds in New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the industrial Midwest and West Coast, but also Republican states such as Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, and Indiana. Obama assembled a diverse coalition, winning almost the entire black vote, many Hispanic voters, and many young voters. He was elected with only 43% of the nation's white vote. Few presidents have faced a set of challenges as serious as those Obama faced on taking office. The economy was in crisis and the country was involved in 2 wars, but many Americans saw Obama's election as a cause for optimism. On January 20th, 2009, Obama was inaugurated as president, with more than 1 million people traveling to Washington, D.C. to view the historic event. In his inaugural address, Obama rebuked 8 years of Bush's policies and the assumptions that had shaped the government since Reagan's election. He promised a foreign policy based on diplomacy, pledged to protect the environment, spoke of the need to fight income inequality and ensure access to health care, and blamed a culture of greed and irresponsibility for contributing to the economic crisis. He also promised to respect the Constitution. Unlike Bush, Obama said little of freedom in his speech, stressing instead the community and responsibility. His speech harked back to the Revolutionary era ideals of putting the common good before individual self interest. This is President Barack Obama and his family greeting enthusiastic supporters at an outdoor celebration in Chicago on the night of his election as president on November 2008. Here is the campaign map for the presidential election. You can tell this one wasn't as close as the other ones. Our next focus question: what kind of change did voters hope for when they elected Obama? Obama's first initiatives lived up to his promises for change. In the first 3 months, he announced plans to close the prison in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and named to the Supreme Court Sonia Sotomayor, the first Hispanic and third woman ever to serve on it. His first budget recalled the New Deal and the Great Society, anticipating active government support for healthcare reform, clean energy, public education, part of which would be paid by allowing Bush's tax cuts for the wealthy to expire in 2010. He pushed through Congress a stimulus package of $800 billion in new government spending for construction, unemployment benefits, and aid to states to help them balance their budgets. The largest single spending bill in U.S. history, the bill was meant to inject money into the economy and save and create jobs and spark a recovery. A year into the Obama presidency, in spring of 2010, one of the worst environmental catastrophes of the U.S. history occurred. A British petroleum oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico exploded and spewed millions of gallons of oil into the sea. The Gulf oil spill illustrated some of the downsides of deregulation and the limits of government and regulatory reach in the global economy. Additionally, most of the first year of the Obama presidency saw intense congressional debate over the restructuring of the nation's healthcare system in order to give insurance to millions who lacked it and stop abusive practices by insurance companies. In March of 2010, after months of bitter debate, Congress passed a sweeping healthcare bill that required all Americans to purchase healthcare insurance and most businesses to provide it to their employees. It also gave some subsidies to people with low income so that they could afford the insurance. This aroused intense opposition from some who called it a government takeover of healthcare, even though plans for government-run insurance programs were dropped from the main bill. Every Republican in Congress voted against it. Throughout Obama's presidency, Republicans remained bitterly opposed to the new law, and in 2013, the Republican-dominated Congress shut down the federal government in order to get the president to abandon the health care law. These efforts backfired, and by 2015, Obamacare proved to be remarkably successful, insuring 16 million Americans. The number of uninsured Americans would have been even lower, but 23 Republican-controlled states refused to expand Medicaid coverage for their poorest residents, even though nearly all of the cost would have been covered by the federal government. Moreover, the Supreme Court twice rejected challenges to the constitutionality of Obamacare. This photograph, taken in 2010, depicts the 4 women who have served on the U.S. Supreme Court. From left to right, Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female justice appointed in 1981, Sonia Sotomayor, 2009, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, 1993, and Elena Kagan, 2010. A marine bird soaked in oil from the damaged offshore drilling platform of British Petroleum in the Gulf of Mexico. Another significant measure enacted in 2010 was a financial regulatory reform law that sought to place under increased federal oversight many of the transactions that had helped to create the economic crisis. The law represented a reversal of the policies of the last 50 years that gave banks a free hand in their operation, but it did not require the breakup of banks deemed too big to fail. And it left open the possibility of future taxpayer bailouts. Moreover, when the banks complained, officials in charge of the new regulations watered them down even more. Taken together, the measures of Obama's first year and a half in office saw the most dramatic domestic reform legislation since the Great Society of the 1960s. While change was a successful campaign slogan, many Obama supporters did not think these reforms went far enough. The healthcare bill failed to include a public option. Obama chose as his economic advisors from Wall Street and had done little to help homeowners facing foreclosure. During 2008 and 2009, the economy lost 8 million jobs, and it would take a long time to recover those. In 2014, the economic recovery finally gathered momentum, although it still remained weak. Consumer spending and confidence were on the rise, and the unemployment was falling. Home sales were rising, and the stock market reached record highs. However, Americans' wages remained stagnant, with a continuing decline in the power of unions and wealth accumulation for 1% of earners. Real incomes of most families declined, and deepening economic inequality. The middle class shrunk, and those living in poverty increased. At the bottom of the social scale, Americans employed by some of the largest corporations received low wages at or slightly above the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. This wage is lower in income adjusted for inflation than 50 years before. Many workers had flexible schedules, meaning they didn't know the number of hours that they would work, making planning for childcare and other obligations nearly impossible. Nearly three-quarters of Americans, helped by government assistance, have a working member, so in effect, the taxpayer subsidized low wages of highly profitable corporations. In 2011, the country witnessed the emergence of a movement that targeted the depredations of Wall Street banks. The Occupy Wall Street movement began with a few young protesters camping in Zuccotti Park in the heart of New York's financial district on September 17, 2011. Over the next 2 weeks, hundreds of people camped in the park and others took part in rallies organized by the Occupy movement in cities worldwide, while protesters began to be evicted by city authorities in spring of 2012. Much of the rhetoric protesting the control of the 1%, by which they meant the very richest Americans, over the economy and connectedly national and international power structures had entrenched itself into national political vocabulary. It also spurred a movement among low paid workers demanding a raise in hourly minimum wage. In 2014, Seattle and Los Angeles raised their minimum wages to $15 an hour. Rising inequality had profound social consequences, including the United States falling behind other advanced countries. More than one-fifth of American children lived in poverty in 2015, a measure on which the United States ranked 29th among advanced countries in life expectancy at birth. The American middle class continued to shrink, and social mobility stood at a lower level in the United States than in Western Europe. This is a chart showing how much of the nation's total income has been enjoyed by the top 10% of families from 1910 to 2015. This is an index of income inequality. There was a sharp drop during World War II, which persisted until 1980 when shares began to rise. Today, income inequality is near historic highs. Our next focus question: what were the major challenges of Obama's first term? The majority of job growth occurred in the high and low end of the pay scales, and manufacturing jobs for mostly males, those with limited education, but that offered middle class incomes, started to rebound from their low point in 2009, but they were still depressed. African Americans suffered the most from the recession. Often, family wealth was invested in their homes instead of in stocks, and thus any stock market recovery was of no help for bouncing back during the nation's slow climb out of the recession's low point. In 2016, the median family wealth for white families was $171,000, but that of blacks was only $17,600. Black unemployment remained nearly double that of whites, and two-thirds of all black children lived in low-income families. Despite the grim reality, Obama's election spurred discussions of whether the United States had overcome its legacy of racial inequality. Talk proliferated of a new post-racial America in which racial differences were no longer affected public private policy or private attitudes. In 2013, the Supreme Court used this logic to invalidate the heart of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and said that Southern states should no longer be required to get permission from the Justice Department before changing election laws. The decision unleashed a flood of laws limiting early voting and requiring voters to possess state issued identification. These measures were intended to limit the right to vote for poor people of all races, many of whom didn't possess official IDs. A series of events involving the death of an unarmed black man at the hands of police or authorities also suggested that America was not actually post racial. In 2012, the killing of Trayvon Martin, a black teenager killed by a white member of the quote unquote neighborhood watch, who was later acquitted, shook the nation. The 2014 murder of Eric Gardner resulted from police using chokeholds despite those holds being illegal, and a grand jury declined to press charges. These and others, including the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, spurred the creation of a national movement called Black Lives Matter, which demanded that police practices be changed and officers who used excessive force be held accountable. The movement used social media to organize protests, and most of the content was created by bystanders using their cell phones. In Ferguson, Michael Brown's death inspired weeks of sometimes violent street demonstrations, leading to the deployment of the National Guardsmen and illustrating how many police departments still relied on excessive force when dealing with black men, and that the criminal justice system remained racialized. Nationally, public reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement revealed a sharp divide between black and white Americans, with 80% of the former and only 30% of the latter agreeing that blacks are victims of discriminatory treatment by police. This is a map showing the distribution of poverty in the United States. The darker the color, the higher the percentage of families living below the poverty line. Areas with concentrations of African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, along with portions of Appalachia inhabited by whites, have the highest poverty rates. This shows a heavily armed police confronting a protester in Ferguson, Missouri during the demonstrations there. The most dramatic foreign affairs achievement of Obama's first term was ending the American involvement in the Iraq War, and by the end of 2011, the last American soldiers were home from Iraq. Yet Obama did not dismantle some of the presidential powers that Bush had accumulated. While Obama completed his campaign pledge of the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq, he dramatically increased our troop deployments in Afghanistan. Obama found that criticizing presidential power from the outside is much different than actually dismantling it. He both continued the military tribunals and the USA Patriot Act. In May of 2011, to the wide acclaim in the United States, Obama authorized an armed raid into Pakistan that resulted in the death of Osama bin Laden. That same year, Obama sent the Air Force to participate in the NATO campaign to overthrow Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. This resulted in endless civil war, not the restoration of democracy in Libya. Throughout Obama's presidency, American troops or planes were involved in combat as part of an expanded war on terror. And in 2014, Obama abandoned the half-century-old policy of isolating Cuba and moved to resume diplomatic relations with the island. The antagonism that had outlasted the Cold War proved ineffective, and the United States worked instead with the European Union, China, and Russia to resume a relationship after decades of hostilities. In 2015, the United States played a major role in forging an agreement committing to reduced carbon emissions that contributed to climate change. Events overseas presented new challenges and new opportunities for the Obama administration. Beginning in 2011, popular revolts swept the Middle East and toppled dictators in places like Tanzania, Egypt, and Libya. Freedom emerged as a rallying cry of activists, and the Obama administration used human rights as a political weapon while remaining silent about the serious abuses conducted by war on terror allies. In his second term, Obama faced a new crisis when the self-proclaimed Islamic State, or ISIS, took control of parts of Iraq, Syria, and Libya, and began a campaign of exceptional brutality, including videos of horrific executions and sponsoring terrorist acts around the world. By 2018, the face of the counterattacks by the United States and its allies, ISIS was on the defensive throughout the Middle East, having surrendered the territory it had occupied. Another area in which Obama continued the policies of the Bush administration was in government surveillance, both domestic and overseas. The extent of such activity became known in 2013 when Edward Snowden, a former employee of the National Security Agency, released documents online that detailed NSA programs that spied on foreign governments and extensively on American citizens themselves. The Obama administration charged Snowden with violating the Espionage Act of 1917, and to avoid prosecution, Snowden ran to Russia. In 2015, Congress approved a measure curtailing government surveillance of phone records, but much of the government's prying into Americans' communications continued. Here we see President Barack Obama, Vice President Joe Biden, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and other members of Obama's national security team receiving updates on the mission against Osama bin Laden at the White House, May 1, 2011. This photograph depicts a drone, an unmanned armed aircraft controlled electronically from the ground, sometimes from thousands of miles away. Drones have been widely used for U.S. air raids in Afghanistan, Syria, and other countries, targeting enemy forces and individuals accused of terrorism without endangering American pilots. Targets on the ground are often mistaken by those controlling the planes, leading to widespread civilian casualties. This cartoon from the New Yorker magazine was inspired by revelations that the National Security Agency had been spying on phone conversations and emails of millions of Americans. In nearly all midterm elections in American history, the party in power has lost congressional seats, but Democrats found it unusually difficult in 2010. Grassroots Republicans were energized by hostilities towards Obama's sweeping legislative enactments. The Tea Party, named as a reference to the Boston Tea Party in the 1770s and inspired by its opposition to taxation by a faraway government, mobilized grassroots opposition to the administration. Obama and congressional Democrats could no longer get any significant legislation through Congress, but neither could Republicans because of the Democratic majority in the Senate. Instead, Tea Party-inspired Republicans took their political agenda to the state level, and a number of states had legislation passed that limited voting rights, public employee union rights, and abortion rights, and took aim at undocumented immigrants. Despite the continuing economic crisis, sociocultural issues played a major role in the campaigning of the 2012 presidential nomination. GOP candidates vied for the support of the evangelical Christians who formed the party's base and worked to bring in support from the Tea Party faction. Mitt Romney won the GOP's presidential nomination and Paul Ryan that of the vice presidency. Obama retained the Democratic Party's nomination for re-election. Despite a number of political liabilities gained during his first term, Obama won re-election in 2012 with 51% of the popular vote to Romney's 47%. Obama's victory was due in part to his Get Out the Vote organization on Election Day and Romney's weaknesses as a campaigner. He was viewed as a millionaire who used loopholes to avoid paying taxes and who ordinary people held in contempt. But more important was the new diversity of the United States. Although Romney won 60% of the white vote, which would have previously guaranteed victory, Obama won 90% of the black vote and over 70% of the Asians and Hispanics. One of the most striking realities of the year's federal elections was the Supreme Court ruling in Citizens United versus Federal Elections Committee. The political action committees, or PACs, were allowed to spend as much money as they wanted on campaigns, thus bringing the joint cost of presidential and congressional campaigning that year to over $6 billion. In the spring of 2009, Republicans and independents opposed to Obama's stimulus plan held tea parties around the country, seeking to invoke the tradition of the Boston Tea Party in its opposition to taxation. In this demonstration in Austin, Texas, some participants wore hats reminiscent of the Revolutionary War. One participant carries a sign urging the state to secede from the Union. And our next focus question: what was divisive about Donald Trump's campaign and early presidency? As the election year 2016 began, all signs pointed to a victory for Hillary Clinton. She had long political experience as a senator and secretary of state, and many women were galvanized by the prospect of the nation's first female president. Clinton, however, faced a surprisingly robust challenge for nomination from Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, who wanted to strengthen and expand the regulatory policies and social safety net through such measures as universal health insurance and limits on corporations' political spending. Sanders spoke to widespread discontent with a society in which those who had plunged the country into an economic crisis walked away scot free while taxpayers were left to pick up the pieces. Sanders accused Clinton of being part of a political establishment whose policies had widened the gap between the 1% at the top of American economy and everyone else. One of the remarkable accomplishments of his campaign was to put the word socialism, long banished because of the Cold War, back into the vocabulary of American politics. With the united support of the Democratic Party establishment, Clinton secured the nomination. Meanwhile, Republicans fractured. 17 candidates, including governors, senators, and business leaders, presented themselves. Donald Trump, a New York real estate developer and television celebrity, shocked the country and the world by winning the Republican nomination. Trump's campaign played on both racial and gender resentments spawned by the growing diversity of American society and the rapid changes in gender roles, as well as the widespread sense, especially in areas suffering from the decline of manufacturing, that millions of ordinary Americans had been left behind by the recovery from the Great Recession. Trump did not speak much about freedom. He preferred to invoke slogans suggesting military and economic power, such as Make America Great Again and America First. Trump's policies marked a significant change in the national sense of purpose, inspired in part by weariness with the seemingly endless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. No longer would the United States see itself as global policemen with a mission to uphold freedom across the globe. Trump's political outlook had a strong racial component. When he announced his candidacy, Trump condemned immigrants from Mexico as murderers and rapists and galvanized supporters by promising to build a wall along the long border with Mexico to stop people from entering the country. He did not have a conventional campaign organization, spent little on television ads, and didn't seek newspaper endorsements. He spread his views via social media and through large rallies. While presidential campaigns have always included scurrilous charges, never before had a major party candidate claimed that his predecessor was not an American citizen or promised to jail his opponent. Allegations that the 3 times married Trump had conducted numerous affairs, and the release of a video that showed him making lewd remarks about women and boasting about sexually harassing them, which would have destroyed the prospects of a more conventional candidate, did little to dent his support. Despite her long political experience, Clinton failed to address effectively the widespread anxiety about the economic and cultural effects of globalism and large-spread immigration. Trump appealed successfully to nostalgia for a time when people of color and women knew their place, and American manufacturing dominated the world economy. Trump realized that social media had transformed American politics, allowing him to communicate inexpensively with millions of followers. Like Obama in 2008, Trump promised to change to a country unhappy with the status quo. Clinton seemed to represent more of the same. Throughout 2016, public opinion polls showed Clinton almost certain to be elected, but Trump triumphed, impossibly the biggest upset in American political history. Although he trailed Clinton by around 3 million popular votes, he achieved victory in the Electoral College. Overall, the results revealed a sharp divide between rural and small-town America, which is predominantly white in population and suffering economic decline, which Trump carried with large minorities, and with the economically thriving, multicultural, large metropolitan areas, which went overwhelmingly for Clinton. Trump won 58% of white voters, but only a third of Hispanics and 8% of blacks. Clinton carried 54% of female voters, but in a humiliating rebuff, the majority of white women voted for Trump. Trump's victory was part of a global voter revolt against a political establishment that many people blamed for job losses, stagnant wages, and large-scale immigration, all elements of globalization. Throughout the world, strongmen who showed willingness to dispense with democratic norms and stir up hatreds rooted in national or tribal identity have consolidated their authority. And in disorienting times, it seemed many people wanted strong authority figures at the helm of their nation, as well as a secure sense of belonging and national identity. This is Hillary Clinton at a campaign rally in North Carolina a few days before the 2016 election. Donald Trump at a rally in West Virginia during his campaign for the 2016 Republican presidential nomination. He wears a hard hat as part of his appeal for support from the state's coal miners and, more broadly, blue collar workers suffering the impacts of deindustrialization. In the summer of 2016, a group of activists placed an ice sculpture, the American Dream, near the Republican and Democratic national conventions. During the gatherings, the sculpture melted away, symbolizing the widespread sense of declining economic opportunity. And here is a map of the presidential election of 2016, with Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote, 48% to 46%, and Donald Trump taking the electoral vote, 56% to 43%. Despite his promise to upend the political system, many of Trump's policies as president were standard conservative Republican fare. Trump's main legislative achievement during his first 2 years in office was a massive tax cut. In keeping with supply side economics, most of the benefits were directed towards corporations and the wealthiest Americans, on the theory that they would then invest the money they saved in economically productive activities and higher wages. But many corporations use their tax windfall not for productive purposes, but instead to buy back their own stock, enriching investors and corporate executives. Wage increases continued to lag behind inflation, so that most Americans saw no economic gain. Trump did, however, break with Republican free trade orthodoxy by raising tariffs on goods imported from China, Canada, and the European Union in the hopes of promoting American manufacturing. The results of what he called his trade war remain to be seen. In both foreign and domestic affairs, Trump seemed determined to erase as much of Obama's legacy as possible. Despite his party's majorities in both houses of Congress, Trump relied on executive orders, not legislation, to erase many of Obama's initiatives. Early in Trump's presidency, evidence accumulated that the Russian government had interfered in the 2016 election by spreading disinformation on social media and hacking into the email servers of the Democratic National Committee. Russian President Vladimir Putin seems to have promoted Trump's campaign in the hope that Trump would remove some of the economic sanctions of the United States and other countries had instituted after Russia invaded and annexed Crimea, a part of the nation of Ukraine. The Justice Department appointed a special prosecutor, Robert Mueller, to determine whether illegal collusion had occurred between Trump's campaign and Russian officials. As time went on, Mueller expanded his investigation to include other forms of campaign malfeasance by a number of people close to the president. Mueller's final report, however, found no evidence that Trump had personally conspired with the Russians, but did suggest that he had attempted to obstruct the investigation. As president, Trump kept up his rhetorical attacks on Mexicans, Muslims, and immigrants more generally. But during 2017 and 2018, when his party controlled both houses of Congress, he failed to convince lawmakers to authorize the building of his border wall or to legislate at all on immigration. Trump had demanded a complete shutdown of Muslim immigration into the United States during the campaign, and one of his first acts as president was to ban travel to the United States from a number of Muslim-majority countries. Federal courts blocked the ban as a form of religious discrimination. Eventually, the Supreme Court allowed a watered-down version to go into effect. In the summer of 2018, the administration began removing young children from the custody of parents who had come to the southern border of the United States with their families, seeking asylum. The pictures of young children, even toddlers, separated from their parents and held in cage-like structures on abandoned army bases caused an uproar, and a judge ordered the administration to reunite the families. Misinformation abounded in the continuing debate over immigration. Trump repeatedly blamed undocumented immigrants for urban crime, even though their crime rate and that of newcomers legally in the United States was far lower than that of native-born Americans. About 12% of the country's population in 2018 was born abroad, but when asked about the number in polls, most Americans gave an average response of 38%. One area in which Trump turned back not only on Obama's policies but also on the rest of the world was his administration's response to the problem of global warming, a slow rise in the Earth's temperature that scientists warn could have disastrous effects on the climate and human life more broadly. Global warming is caused when carbon dioxide released by burning fossil fuels such as oil and coal remain in the upper atmosphere, trapping heat reflected from the Earth. Climate change threatens to disrupt long established patterns of agriculture and lead to a large expansion of the size of the world's deserts. The melting of glaciers and polar ice caps because of rising temperatures will eventually raise ocean levels, flooding coastal cities. Global warming exacerbates the destructiveness of hurricanes, wildfires, and other natural disasters. But while this was not originally a partisan issue, during the 1990s, and more Republicans came to reject the scientific consensus that human activity causes climate change. They opposed efforts to promote sources of energy such as solar and wind power that would reduce our dependency on oil and coal. In 2017, Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement, making the United States the only country in the world not to commit itself to taking steps to reducing emissions that cause climate change. Late in 2018, the government scientists issued a report predicting dire consequences, from widespread flooding to ever more intense storms and wildfires and serious crop failures, if climate change is not addressed. But the Trump administration continued its efforts to reduce regulations aimed at combating global warming. President Trump's travel ban barring persons from several Muslim-majority countries from entering the United States led to widespread protests, in which images of the Statue of Liberty are prominently displayed, such as this one in Seattle, January 20th, 2018. At the end of 2018, the Trump administration inspired an international uproar when it began separating families seeking to enter the United States from Mexico. It held the children in cage-like structures. The courts ordered that families be reunited. Trump's unprecedented conduct as candidate continued in office. He held virtually no press conferences. Instead, he issued a daily barrage of tweets, promoting his ideas and insulting political opponents, critics, and even political allies. Often his tweets had a racial component. The tone set by the president helped to produce a coarsening of public discourse. President Trump exacerbated the intense polarization that had been a feature of politics since Clinton's presidency. Many people were deeply offended by his derogatory remarks about women. On the day after his inauguration, the Women's March on Washington brought hundreds of thousands of people to the nation's capital to express their support for women's rights, immigration reform, racial equality, and protection of the environment. Another expression of women's activism, the Me Too movement, brought to light evidence of rampant sexual harassment by entertainment moguls, business leaders, public officials, and other powerful men. With some economic recovery and unemployment at a historic low, a conventional politician would have emphasized economic issues in the midterm elections of 2018, not Trump. In the last weeks of the campaign, he traveled the country holding rallies where he whipped up fear of immigrants. These appeals consolidated his political base but alienated more moderate voters. With Democrats and many independents galvanized by opposition to Trump's policies and his behavior, the elections of 2018 in part reversed the verdict of 2 years earlier. Democrats replaced Republicans in 40 seats in the House of Representatives, gaining control of that body. Trump's policies and demeaning comments regarding women produced a giant gender gap in voting. The gap was even wider among young voters. On the other hand, Republicans increased their majority in the Senate. In the 2018 elections, revealed other deep divides between rural areas strongly Republican and cities and suburbs dominated by Democrats, and between Republicans almost entirely white and largely male support and the diversity of Democrats. These patterns were reflected in the new House of Representatives. Over 100 women were elected to the body, and the most in American history. Of the 42 new female members, 38 were Democrats and 23 new people of color elected to Congress. Only one of those was Republican. Thus, two visions of America clashed, one based on exclusion and whiteness, and the other welcoming diversity. Both were deeply rooted in their American experiences. On January 21st, 2017, the day after the inauguration of President Trump, 3 million people participated in the women's marches throughout the country, including one that brought 500,000 people to the nation's capital. They called for protection of women's rights and immigrants' rights, but also protested the crude language Trump employed about women and his boasts about committing acts of sexual harassment. Our final focus question: what were the prevailing ideas of American freedom at the beginning of the 20th century? The century that ended in 2000 witnessed vast human progress and unimaginable human tragedy. This was the first century in which the primary economic activity for most of humankind moved beyond acquisition of basic food, clothing, and shelter. But it was also a century of uncounted millions dead in wars and genocides, along with the widespread degradation of the environment. In the early 21st century, people in the United States lived longer and healthier lives compared with previous generations, and they enjoyed a level of material comfort unimagined a century before. In 2018, more than 1 American in 7 was older than 65, a figure almost guaranteed to rise, and one that spikes worries about economic stability of Social Security and the future costs of healthcare. It also suggests that people would enjoy far longer lives in periods of retirement. However, poverty, income inequality, and infant mortality in the United States considerably exceeded other economically advanced countries. Labor concerns remained unsolved, and fewer than 10% of Americans in private firms belonged to unions, a figure not seen since the 19th century. Many changes have positively affected Americans, including women and minority populations. In other ways, the United States remains a country concerned primarily with individual advancement more than to broad social welfare. The United States also remains a far more religious country compared to other economically advanced countries. Religion and nationalism reinforce each other far more powerfully in the United States. Other forms of American exceptionalism have a dark side, including the highest murder rate in the world using guns, with 9,146 American murders versus 158 in Germany, 173 in Canada, and 11 in Japan in 2012. Some of the most horrific instances of gun violence have occurred as mass shootings in schools, including the 1999 tragedy at Columbine High School, the 2007 attack at Virginia Tech University, and the unthinkable murder of 20 first graders at Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012. Other mass shootings occurred in public places, including a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, and a historically black church in Charleston, South Carolina. The gunman in the Charleston case was a racist white informed by internet sites with white supremacy groups. In March of 2018, hundreds of thousands of young people took part in demonstrations across the country for gun control under the slogan March for Our Lives, but it is not supported by major gun organizations like the National Rifle Association. The United States also lags behind other countries in providing social rights to its citizens, with vacations and sick days not guaranteed by law. Only 3 countries in the world have no national provision for maternity leave for women: Papua New Guinea, Suriname, and the United States. The United States has the highest rate of imprisonment in the world by far. In the early 21st century, Americans were increasingly tolerant of diverse personal lifestyles, cultural backgrounds, and religious persuasions, thanks to the rights revolution and to the political ascendancy of the anti-government conservatives. The dominant definition of freedom stressed the capacity of individuals to realize their desires unrestricted by authority. Other American traditions, such as freedom of economic security, freedom as active participation in government, and freedom as social justice, seem to be in eclipse. Americans enjoy more personal freedom than ever before, but little industrial freedom, as globalization has rendered individual and even national sovereignty all but meaningless. It remains to be seen whether a conception of freedom grounded in access to the consumer marketplace and the glorification of individual self fulfillment unrestrained by government, social citizenship, or a common public culture could provide an adequate way of comprehending the world of the 21st century. Something you're probably familiar with, a lockdown drill, this one occurring in Belle Plaine, Minnesota, trains eighth graders how to respond in the event of a school shooting. This 2017 Hank Williams Thomas artist, combined with photographer Emily Shore, reimagined Norman Rockwell's famous 1943 painting Freedom from Want, which we covered in Chapter 22. Today it depicts America's more diverse society. The work also brings to mind post-Civil War engravings of Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving dinner, as we saw in Chapter 15. In a politically polarized nation, history itself has become a battleground. Debates proliferate over the fate of public monuments to the Confederacy and its leaders. Some see these statues as harmless expressions of Southern civic heritage, while to others they represent the glorification of slavery and racism. Some statues have recently been taken down. The monuments controversy took a deadly turn in August of 2017 when a group of white supremacists and neo-Nazis marched in Charlottesville, Virginia, chanting anti-Semitic and racist slogans to demand the statue of Robert E. Lee remain in place. They were confronted by opposing demonstrators. Violent clashes ensued, leading to the death of a woman who was mowed down when a marcher ran his car into the anti-racist side of the crowd. To the dismay of many Americans, including members of his own party, President Trump refused to apportion blame. He instead sat out a tweet lamenting the removal of Confederate statues, claiming such actions tore apart the history and culture of our great country. Inadvertently, the president has raised the perennial question: who is an American? Our history and culture are far more complex and diverse than he appears to realize. Existing monuments and statues, however, mostly celebrate only one piece of an American story. There are innumerable statues of Confederate generals, for example, but virtually none of the Black Civil War soldiers and leaders of the Reconstruction. A step towards more inclusive public presentation of history came in 2018 with the opening of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice and Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. This site commemorates over 4,000 victims of lynching between 1980 and the 1950s. They, too, are part of our history. As of the end of 2018, the world seems far less stable than anyone could have predicted when the Cold War ended. The future of the entire Middle East remained uncertain. China's rapidly growing economic power posed a challenge to the Americans' predominance. Relations with Russia were at their lowest point since the end of the Cold War. A study by American intelligence agencies predicted that by 2025, the United States will remain the world's most powerful nation, but that its economic and military predominance will have declined significantly. Freedom remains central to America's sense of themselves as individuals and as a nation. Americans continue to debate contemporary issues in a political landscape shaped by ideas of freedom. Indeed, freedom remains and has always been an evolving concept. Its definition open to disagreement, its boundaries never fixed or final. Freedom is neither self-enforcing nor self-correcting. It cannot be taken for granted, and its preservation requires eternal vigilance, especially in times of crisis. These are the neo-Nazis and white supremacists marching through the campus of the University of Virginia in August 2017 to protest plans to remove a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. A violent altercation with counter-demonstrators followed. Many contemporary artists seek to make Americans more aware of their history. Plantation Monopoly by Colin Quashie redesigns the popular board game to take place in a pre-Civil War slave plantation. And these are seeking lessons from history. This is a young visitor at the Civil Rights Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. He is part of our history too. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture and this course. Here are the focus questions that we went over. As always, I absolutely welcome your input and your feedback. I hope that you have found this course illuminating and that it's given you a deeper knowledge of American history. As always, please feel free to email me with any questions or comments you may have.